Okay, Charlene, let's start.
Yes.
Thank you. So, welcome everybody to this APFIC technical webinar, one of the APFIC webinar series. And this webinar is on subsidies and the current negotiations at the WTO. There we go.
Yeah.
Now, is that that's the full slide showing, right?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, welcome everyone to this APFIC webinar, subsidies and the current negotiations at the WTO. My name is Simon Funn-Smith. I am the Secretary of the Asia Pacific Fishery Commission, of which this webinar is one of the technical series that we're organizing. The Asia Pacific Fishery Commission, otherwise known as APFIC, the webinar series, is something that we've been trying to provide to our member countries and stakeholders as a result of the constraints that have been placed upon our work by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has prevented us organizing face-to-face physical workshops and meetings. And so we've been convening APFIC activities through virtual events and webinars over the past year. We've been partnering with INFOFISH to do this, and we'd like to thank INFOFISH for making this possible and all of their excellent arrangements. And this technical webinar series is something that we've been running in the run-up to our formal commission session in May. We've had 500 participants register for this WTO webinar, and we'd like to welcome you all to this. The invitation has been open, not just to APFIC member countries and governments, but we've made this as broad as possible, inviting both fisheries and aquaculture stakeholders from across the APFIC region and beyond. We have registered participants from within Asia, but also right away across the world. Importantly, these webinars are recorded. That means that they will be available after the event and they can be communicated. Please share the links with your colleagues when the links go up, and you will be able to, and they will be able to watch these webinars at a later date. The webinar that we are organizing today is based around the APFIC, FAO and UNCTAD webinar, which is looking at subsidies and the current negotiations at the WTO. The idea of this webinar is to provide a forum to enhance general understanding of the negotiation history of the fisheries subsidies discussions at the WTO. In particular, the main pillars of those discussions and how they link to each other and how they link to existing instruments, and the various proposals and the approaches that are being taken will be discussed during the webinar. The idea of the webinar is to integrate the history of what has been going on, and also analyze some of the critical outstanding issues that are central to these discussions on fisheries subsidies. And in particular, to discuss how the various multilateral trade, oceans and fisheries governance frameworks link to this and how they integrate into the negotiations. We're also going to touch on the availability of technical and advisory support to countries, also involving the possible implementation of an agreement on fisheries subsidies, including the interagency cooperation and technical assistance provided for that. And in that regard, we will be talking about the UNCTAD-FAO-UNEP interagency plan of action, and that will be presented during the webinar as a possible vehicle, as a vehicle for coherent and timely support for the Asia Pacific region. The agenda of the webinar is as follows. We have this short opening by myself as moderator. We will then have a presentation from Ambassador Santiago Wills of Colombia, who is the chair of the negotiating group on rules at the WTO. He will make a presentation on the history of negotiations on fisheries subsidies at the WTO and its current status. He will be able to take a few questions from the panelists after that, and it will be followed by a short break. That then will be followed by a presentation from my colleague, Mr. Marcio Castro de Souza from FAO headquarters in Rome. He is a senior fisheries officer for international trade. And his presentation will be on the Fisheries International Framework, the main pillars of the negotiations of WTO, and the fisheries subsidies and their cross-linkages with the FAO instruments. His presentation will be followed then by a presentation from my colleague, Mr. David Vivas, who is the legal officer at the Division on International Trade and Commodities at UNCTAD in Geneva. His presentation will be on developing countries and the major concepts involved at the WTO negotiations on fisheries subsidies. After those presentations, we'll have a question and answer session for about 20 to 30 minutes, and that will involve the panelists, David and Marcio, and myself as a moderator. We are trying to stick to time, but it is very possible that we will extend if there is sufficient interest and questions. We will perhaps go a little bit beyond the 1.5 hour agenda that we've set ourselves there. And we will see how that goes as the time progresses. But with that, I would like to now move on and get this webinar off the ground. And so the first presentation, and I would like to welcome then Ambassador Santiago Wills of Colombia, and would like to thank him very much for taking time to share with us now his perspectives on the history of the negotiations. Your Excellency, please.
Thank you very much, Simon, and good morning to everyone, or good afternoon or evening even, depending on where you're listening from. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the APFIC, FAO and UNCTAD for inviting me to this webinar. It seems like it's going to be very interesting hearing other views from outside the negotiations on the negotiations. So I'm looking forward to that. And of course, to you, Simon, for your opening remarks and the introduction to this session. With that, let me give a brief summary of the history of the negotiations on fishery subsidies and where we are now. For the reasons that were eloquently put as a confluence of intellectual, institutional, and political factors in the UNEP's publication from 2010, in 2001, the WTO established a mandate to negotiate fisheries subsidies as part of the Doha round. Afterwards, the Hong Kong Ministerial Conference at the end of 2005 emphasized again the importance of having disciplines to prohibit fisheries subsidies that contribute to overfishing and overcapacity. However, despite a lot of work, these negotiations went a bit quiet in mid-2011. Intense negotiations restarted soon after the 2015 UN General Assembly adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development with target 14.6, which states that the WTO negotiations on fisheries subsidies, and I quote here, should by 2020 prohibit certain forms of fisheries subsidies which contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, and eliminate subsidies that contribute to IUU fishing, and refrain from introducing new such subsidies, recognizing that appropriate and effective special and differential treatment for developing and least developed countries should be an integral part of the WTO fisheries subsidies negotiation. So that's our most recent mandate from the SDG 14.6. However, that mandate was echoed by the decision at the WTO's 11th Ministerial Conference, which established a deadline by the following Ministerial Conference, that is MC12, which was to be held in December 2019, later scheduled for June 2020. The implied calendar deadline was missed, partly because the previous chair had to leave Geneva in July 2019, and it was only until November that members were able to agree to a new chair, and I took up the role. However, the deadline established by WTO ministers still hold, as MC12 is yet to take place, in principle, in end of November of this year. So following my appointment as chair in November 2019, the negotiations intensified, and in early 2020, it seemed that an agreement in MC12, which then was scheduled for June 2020, was possible. Unfortunately, several factors intervened. COVID-19 and the restrictions of movement meant no physical meetings, the postponement of MC12, and the announcement by the previous WTO Director General Roberto Acevedo that he would be leaving, meaning that the DG instance would not be available to support the process. Despite these setbacks, work continued and we made significant progress. In June 2020, members accepted a draft consolidated document, a single document mainly made of facilitators' drafts and member submissions as a basis for our work. This text has evolved and is now in its second revision. But before I move on these substantive topics, I know some of you are already thinking, wait, the negotiations started in 2001, so that's 20 years ago. So allow me to deviate for 2 minutes to provide some reasons as to why it has taken so long. And of course, please don't take this as a justification for spending 20 years in negotiating this agreement, because I agree that 20 years is way too long for any type of agreement. But instead, maybe take this as an insight as of why it has been so hard to conclude this process. Partly, the long time it has taken is because the negotiations are not as simple as they appear. There are already international agreements and laws on fishing and fisheries management. There is the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, the UN Fish Stocks Agreement, the FAO Port State Measures Agreement, plus other international agreements, plans of action, and codes of conduct. Many of these also took years to develop, and despite the effort that went into developing them, the problems of illegal fishing and overfishing have not gone away. Actually, they have got worse. One reason they are worse would be because one important part of the puzzle is missing, and that is a prohibition on harmful subsidies. As this is a very important part of the puzzle, we have to make sure it fits with the other parts, and doing that is not simple, even if nobody's debating the need for it to fit. So fitting our part of the puzzle in the current state of international agreements and regulations dealing with fisheries is not an easy task. Another problem is the lack of reliable data. For example, illegal fishing is known to be significant, but of course, illegal fishers do not report their catch, and nobody would admit to subsidizing them. Indeed, I do not think any country deliberately subsidizes IUU fishing, but with no reports, we do not know exactly how big the problem is. But I think we can agree that even the smallest estimates indicate that IUU fishing is a big problem. Similarly, for subsidies, the WTO has a definition of a subsidy in the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures. But not every member notifies its subsidies, and most of those that do notify do not provide data on the value of their subsidies. Meanwhile, other organizations use different definitions, like the OECD for its fisheries subsidies estimate. But this does not cover all WTO members, and the data is not always consistent from one OECD member to another, or for the other countries that provide data. Other people provide other estimates, like the Sea Around Us project, but they also use different methodologies, and it is hard to compare results or reconcile differences. Another point to bear in mind is that the WTO agreement on fisheries subsidies will be a legally binding agreement. So precise terms and definitions are important, and they have to apply across all 164 members. In some cases, we can use other agreements, such as the definition of IUU fishing. But in some cases, there are no international agreed definitions, such as subsistence or artisanal fishing. So at this stage, most delegations agree it will be difficult for the WTO to establish a lot of new definitions. So creative ways have to be found to get around using these terms. Also, the WTO has lots of agreements, but they all deal with trade and trade-related issues. This is really the first time that negotiations are about sustainability. That means we have had to change our mindset a bit. A lot of negotiators have experience with subsidies and their impact on trade, but what impact does a subsidy have on sustainability is a new issue for us. But after many years of negotiation, fortunately, we appear to be getting familiar with it. So that's good news after 20 years. So let me go back then to where I left off before this short explanatory break. Last year in 2020, despite the pandemic, the negotiating group accomplished an impressive milestone. That is, accepting a single draft consolidated document as the basis for the work ahead. However, as the text has evolved, we are now in the second revision of such text, as I mentioned before, but progress has slowed down, and this is normal, because now members have to make decisions on some critical points, and I would like to highlight some of those critical points. First, concerning the prohibition of subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. In many ways, this is at the heart of the negotiations. The current draft text for this issue presents a compromise approach that sits between the two different approaches that have been discussed for years without resolution for prohibiting subsidies that contribute to overfishing overcapacity. These are a prohibition based on a list of prohibited subsidies, or a prohibition only when subsidies have caused negative effects on fisheries resources. The compromise hybrid approach, as we call it now, in the text contains a list of presumptively prohibited subsidies, modulated by a provision that would permit such subsidies to be provided where measures are in place to maintain fish stocks at a biologically sustainable level. To date, however, while we have had very constructive discussions on the hybrid approach, which have clarified everyone's understanding of what the draft intends to do, and member-specific issues with the text, some members remain entrenched in their preferred approaches. In particular, some members continue to argue for a pure list approach, where the listed subsidies would never be allowed under any circumstances. They say that the problem is structural overcapacity, and the only way to address this is to prohibit subsidies that could contribute to it. Others, however, would prefer an approach where subsidies would only be prohibited if insufficient management measures were in place. Second, the question of the due process requirements for illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing determinations. What is clear is that most members need some due process to be able to accept an IUU fishing determination as a trigger of the subsidy prohibition. However, the fundamental issue is drafting the right language. The draft consolidated text first reflected members' concerns by using the language fair, transparent, and non-discriminatory procedures. Based on members' concerns that this was too prescriptive, the text was then revised to a simpler language, only referring to due process. But now some members argue that this is too vague. So the discussion on this important question has become somewhat circular, and we will need to find a way forward. And third, concerning special and differential treatment. All members recognize the final form and scope of special and differential treatment can only be determined once the basic disciplines have come more clearly into focus. That said, as we have moved forward with drafting the disciplines, the discussions on possible SNDT, special and differential treatment, have proceeded apace. There remain, however, substantive differences over how to incorporate SNDT provisions into the fisheries subsidies disciplines. Because some developing WTO members are among the biggest fishing nations in the world and among the biggest subsidizers. Some members think that SNDT should be needs-based and should take the form of transition periods and technical assistance to implement the disciplines. Others say that SNDT provisions should be based on criteria like GNI per capita and share of world fishing. Still others are seeking certain geographical or other carve-outs from the disciplines. At the core of this issue is finding the right balance between providing necessary flexibility through special and differential treatment, while ensuring that this does not undermine the disciplines and thus ultimately the sustainability of fish stocks. Finally, on the process going forward, it is encouraging to see that we all share the sense of urgency to reach a successful outcome, and all members have repeatedly underscored their commitment to be flexible and to engage continuously. We already have held 3 clusters of meetings this year, with a 4th in 2 weeks' time. And we continue to work between the clusters in various configurations and modes at both technical and heads of delegation levels. Recently, as you know, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala assumed her role as Director General of WTO, and the fisheries subsidies negotiations are high on her priority list. I'm working very closely with her on finding ways to unlock some of the key issues going forward. Let me conclude then by saying that we need to finish the job, and soon. As I mentioned earlier, the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference is now scheduled for November 2021 in Geneva, but we cannot wait until November to finish our work, which is long overdue. As I have been saying since end last year, these negotiations are like a debt to the health of the oceans that we, WTO members, owe to the global community. It is a debt that is now overdue. And as with any other debt, not being able to pay it on time does not mean that the debt is gone. In fact, it is a debt that increases every day that goes by. And we now have a very real opportunity to conclude these long-running negotiations. WTO members need to embrace it and make their utmost efforts to find the flexibility, compromise, and political will to make it a reality. I trust this will happen soon. Thank you, and back to you, Simon.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. What a fantastic overview of a complex process. I'm going to now, if with your indulgence, open up to my two colleagues, David Vivas and Marcio de Souza, if they want to follow up with you with one or two pertinent questions based on your presentation just now. So Marcio or David, do one of the other you want to make a short question? David, please.
Yes, first of all, thank you, Ambassador, for your very clear and well-structured presentation today. It helps to focus on key challenges. I have a couple of questions. One is, there have been recently a proposal by Ecuador and Chile on artisanal fisheries seeking an exception. If you could a little bit explain what's the content and what the proposal is seeking, especially because in Asia, the number and the Pacific, the number of small-scale fishers and artisanal fishers is perhaps the largest in the planet. So it could be an issue of interest for the region. The second question is, I have heard many concerns by developing country members on having too much flexibility on countries that have good, well-established management systems versus those that do not have them in terms of capacity to be able to subsidize. The key question this question comes more than from the point of view that if this is good or bad, is that there is a match usually in reality among countries that have good management systems and capacity, and at the same time are also similar or the very same countries that have a large or a significant amount of subsidies. So it looks like such a provision may be hindering any result and be against the purpose and even create a reverse SNDP. So what would be your comments on these 2 points? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David. Of course, you know that I can't go much into the detail of members' positions. That would be a little bit insensitive from my part. But I'll try to do my best to answer both questions because they're both at the heart of the critical issues that we're facing right now, and that will soon be discussed again. So I'll start with the first issue on artisanal fishing, and let me take you back a bit on how this has evolved. I believe it was last year, we had a couple of proposals to carve out from the disciplines of this instrument artisanal fishing. And in saying this, I've always have to remind members, and I'll do it again here, of what the purpose of the negotiations is. And this is to tackle subsidies, not to tackle fishing or fishing activities. And this is a crucial issue, because then is when we question, are the subsidies for artisanal fishing harmful? That is our mandate. And of course, I'm not going to answer this, but this is a question that I keep raising to members. And how do we tackle those harmful subsidies for artisanal fishing? What would be the positive or negative impact of carving out from the disciplines of harmful subsidies artisanal fishing? So those big, broad questions are the ones we're trying to answer now. And as you mentioned, there was a revised proposal on that proposal from Chile, Ecuador, and Argentina. And there was also a separate proposal from Cameroon. I don't remember if it was at the end of last year or the beginning of this year on artisanal fishing. And one difficulty we've had since the beginning, as I mentioned earlier, is to define what is artisanal or what is subsistence fishing or what is small scale. So the purpose I think everybody has in mind is the same. The way we approach it is a bit different on one side or the other. So how do we define this? And this has been one of the major difficulties. Now we're discussing this issue, not trying to define artisanal fishing, but in a way where the situation of those fishers is being more or less characterized in the disciplines. So that when subsidies are targeted to those, let's say, that situational fishers, they wouldn't be comprised within the disciplines of the instrument. But of course, this is just being discussed. In the last cluster we had 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, this was one of the issues that were discussed. So that's still in process, but that's more or less what I can say at this point on that issue. On the other issue on flexibilities, that has been a bit difficult to discuss, is how And again, I'm going to take a step back in saying, what is the mandate we have? So the mandate talks about subsidies, and it talks about harmful subsidies. Not every subsidy, or not specific subsidies for all the time. And as you know, one of the issues why a specific list approach of subsidies has been difficult to agree on, because it's hard to really pick those subsidies that will forever be bad, and that would in any case could be turned as good subsidies or positive subsidies. So with that, what has been involved in the negotiations, as I mentioned earlier, is to find this hybrid approach in saying, look, we need to define, to try to list some of the subsidies that in principle are harmful subsidies. But given that our mandate talks about sustainability and to prohibit harmful subsidies, those subsidies that in principle could be harmful should be allowed if they're not being harmful. So the big difference of what happens nowadays in the status quo and what would happen after the negotiations, hopefully, and this is of course what we're trying to intend, is that if that sustainability-based flexibility that we have in the text remains, subsidizers will need to demonstrate that those subsidies are not harmful. So right now, whether those subsidies are or are not harmful or are causing harm to specific fish stocks, that's basically their problem, and nobody's asking them if they're looking at the fisheries management, if they're actually making this assessment of the stocks. With this instrument and with that sustainability-based flexibility, the idea is that those members will need to demonstrate that there are measures in place to keep the stocks at a biologically sustainable level. So that's already a big change. And of course, and here I'll just send the last topic on this issue. It's a very thin balance where we don't want the WTO to become a fisheries management organization, but at the same time, given that our mandate is on sustainability, we can't really just ignore the harmful effect of the subsidies in sustainability when dealing with the negotiations. So it's a very sensitive topic. There's a lot of issues and elements that need to be taken into account, and as I mentioned, it's a thin balance to strike. But that's what members are trying to do right now. It's something that we're currently discussing in several meetings, and hopefully we can reach some sort of convergence on this issue soon. So I'll leave it there for now, David. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency.
Thank you.
Marcio, do you have a follow-up question? Perhaps just one?
Yes. First of all, thank you, Ambassador, for your presentation. And I think just taking advantage that you of your break in terms of trying to explain the length of the negotiation process, and from an FAO perspective, I think also we have to look at this dichotomy of how empty, how full, how the glass is, and regardless of working and negotiating for 20 years. I just would like to highlight that at the same time, because of the negotiation process, we have been able to put on the table a series of discussions at a high level from countries that have never been touched upon before. So this continuous negotiation process has helped the sector a lot to identify problems, bottlenecks, and also opportunities. So I think that's quite interesting. And I just would like also to reiterate that I also see this negotiation in WTO terms as a game changer in terms of how people think about the process, because it's completely different from agriculture, it's completely different from industrial goods. So we are talking about a common good. The part that is being negotiated is exactly the common good. And WTO was not set taking into consideration common goods, because taking into consideration private goods. So it's a complete mindset. And if you think about changing the mindset of the negotiators and of how we address the problem in 20 years, of course, it's a long time, but it's not a long time for trying to address the problem from different angles. So just to reiterate that we are completely on the same page, how we look at half empty or half full. Thank you again, Ambassador.
Thank you, Marcio. With that, I would like to thank His Excellency Ambassador Santiago Wills. I know you have a very hectic schedule, and I'd like to thank you very much for taking time to join the webinar and to give us your time and perspectives of these negotiations. Thank you very, very much. And we'll now take a very short break.
Thank you very much, Simon. And again, thanks to the FAO, UNCTAD, and APFIC for this very kind invitation.
Thank you. We will now take a few minutes here, just or a few seconds to run through some slides. These are some resources that are available for trade and statistics that relate to the topic today. We'll just get prepared and get ready for the presentation to come from my colleague Marcio Castro de Souza. So maybe Charlene, in 1 minute or 2 minutes, we can then move over and start the presentation from Marcio. So Marcio, if you're ready to, or get ready to come in on that, please.
Sure.
Thank you. I know I can speak from a personal experience anyway, that the statement and comments that I've just heard are an eye-opener for me, particularly the perspectives for the APFIC region or relevance to the APFIC region, and hopefully we will be able to pick these up in the Q&A, particularly some of these tricky issues that relate to demonstrating that subsidy is not harmful, that stocks are managed sustainably. This very, very thorny problem of what constitutes a small scale or an artisanal fishery. All of these questions that have come up and that are currently being wrestled with in the WTO negotiation. Right. Marcio, I think if you're ready, let's get moving before we lose any time. If you're ready now, please. I'll just hand this over now to Marcio, and he will make his presentation on the Fisheries International Framework, the main pillars of the WTO negotiations on fisheries subsidies and their cross-links with FAO instruments. Marcio, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Simon. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all. First of all, I think I'd just like to thank again the organizers, INFOFISH, for this event. We all know how the negotiations on fisheries subsidies are important for the industry as a whole. And as Simon mentioned in the beginning, my presentation is going to cover basically what is the current interlinkages that we have between the main pillars of the negotiations and building upon some of the issues that the ambassador in fact raised, and what we have on the table in terms of the UN instruments and other FAO instruments that can support countries and the industry as a whole to be better prepared for the results of the negotiations, regardless of the level of the rules. The idea here is exactly to show how the instruments can support the sector in being prepared for any type of upcoming rules. That's the overall idea. Before starting my presentation as such, I just would like to ask you, because I'm going to pose some questions during the presentation. So if you can have a mobile device or a tablet, or maybe share your computer screen in order that you can access a web page that I'm going to show to answer some questions during my presentation. to make it more interactive. Of course, the ambassador already reiterated the importance of the negotiations on fisheries subsidies from a fisheries subsidies perspective, from a WTO perspective. But one thing that I think it's quite critical for us to understand is how fish is important in the world. And then I'm going to pose you the first question. I'm going to list here, I'm going to list here four animal proteins that we are going to the 4 animal proteins that in terms of export, the main 4 animal proteins. So I would like you to rank the export value. What is the most important animal protein in export value, and what's the lowest important animal protein in value terms? So you just have to access the page at the top. You have the web address and you have a code. Just type that code and try to rank. You just pick up one by one and put rank 1, rank 2, rank 3, and rank 4. I hope it's working because I don't see. Okay, so the results are coming. Try to rank. So we are only talking here about those 4 animal proteins and what are the most exported one in value terms. So we are not talking about quantity and not talking about commodities in general, only animal proteins. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time during the poll. So let's see. Okay, so the first fish, second cattle, poultry, and pork. That's quite interesting because if we go into usually that's any statistics that's somehow it's not so well known about from the public. This is the total amount in dollar terms of export of fisheries is 56%. So it's more than all other animal proteins that I have ranked altogether. So we have beef 18%, pork 14%, and poultry 12%. And 37% of fisheries products enters international markets. So it's a highly international tradable commodity. And that reinforces the importance of the negotiation in a multilateral scenario like the WTO, even in the case of fisheries subsidies. So we are talking about an animal protein that is very international oriented. That's a very important aspect. In addition to that, we do have a very inclusive participation of countries. So in opposition to the other animal proteins, when you have some big players in the market that produce cattle or poultry, they usually do not import poultry or cattle. But in the case of fisheries, due to the variety of species, even the big producers, they are also big importers. So that makes all the difference in terms of a very inclusive participation of countries. This map shows the trade flow of fisheries and aquaculture products. It was developed by Rabobank, a Dutch bank, and you can easily see that even the biggest producers are also biggest importers and exporters. So it's a very integrated sector in international terms. As I briefly mentioned in my commentary to the ambassador's intervention, the fisheries sector is very unique to the WTO. In the WTO, first of all, fish, there is a very significant difference. Fish, I mean, wild capture fish, usually is not associated to a territory. In WTO, until the negotiations of fisheries subsidies, all the negotiations, they are associated with a product that was raised, farmed, produced, manufactured, or anything else in a physical territory of the country. So fisheries is, for the first time, we're discussing something that does not belong to any country before it is caught, if we're talking about high seas, for example. In addition to that, fishery has a particular nuance, an additional nuance in WTO, because in WTO, there is a breakdown of the products into two different natures. You have the agriculture products and the non-agriculture products. And fisheries is inserted into the non-agriculture products. So together with industrial goods. So fisheries in WTO terms is together with automobiles, with iron, with steel, with other type of product, industrial products. So it's very important, this nuance. We are not together with the agriculture product, who has already very singular rule, very particular rules in connection with subsidies, for example. And as the ambassador was mentioned, there are some very specific fish concepts that are present in the WTO negotiations on fisheries subsidies. And the main three ones are overcapacity, overfishing, and IUU fishing. Those are the three basic concepts associated with the negotiation process on fisheries subsidies. I mean, the fish concepts that have been used in the negotiation process. We have two additional concepts that I'm going to mention later on, but those two concepts are more WTO concepts. And I'm going to explain exactly how that approach and the interconnectivity with fish concepts. And then let me pose another question to all of you. I mentioned three concepts before. The concepts on overcapacity, overfishing, and IUU fishing. I want you to answer how familiar you are with those three concepts. How the audience here is familiar with overcapacity, overfishing, and IUU fishing. So you can choose not familiar at all, very familiar, or I think there is a third option in between that is some sort of, I hope there is, but if you can please try to answer that, because one important aspect is that we also have to think, as the Ambassador Wills mentioned, that WTO is not going to become a fish organization because of the negotiation process. And in addition to that, it's also very important that the industry also feeds their government with information, because the delegates to WTO are usually trade delegates. They can get information from capital regarding fisheries, but they are not fish experts. So it's very important, this continuously mutual feeding process in terms of concepts, in terms of how the system in practical terms work, etc. So let's see the results so far. Okay, so it's above the average, going to very familiar. It's quite interesting, the results here. And so if we go back to the presentation, and I'll say that, as I mentioned, we have been discussing the concepts of IUU fishing, overfishing, overcapacity, and then there are two additional concepts. Small-scale fishers, as the ambassador mentioned about not entering into this discussion to define what is a small scale or artisanal, and the special and differential treatment. Special and differential treatment is a very well established concept in WTO that is associated with allowing developing countries some special conditions to achieve the outcome or to comply with the outcome of any kind of negotiation process. So the idea is that to recognize the challenges that new developing countries face to comply with any kind of new rules. And this kind of special and differential treatment is already explicitly mentioned in the mandate of the fisheries subsidy negotiations. So countries already have agreed that the negotiations should take into consideration the special needs of developing countries. But when you talk about the idea here was exactly to, based on those concepts that I have just mentioned, to show that countries and the sector as a whole, I not mean the government itself, but the private sector too, can facilitate the insertion of the country in the new possible rules on fishery subsidies if they adopt many of the instruments that are already on the table involving fisheries and aquaculture products. So, for example, I'm going to go into more details later, but in FAO, we have a series of instruments that are closely related to those three fish concepts that I mentioned: overcapacity, overfishing, and IUU fishing. So, and many countries are still, they didn't implement yet many of those in FAO instruments. The implementation of those FAO instruments can facilitate a lot these adjustments that the country will have to comply with when they are going to have new rules on fishery subsidies. In addition to that, there are other FAO instruments that are quite important and being mentioned all the time during the negotiation process. Like the ambassador mentioned, the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, that sets some basic principles. And that I would like to highlight two of them. The maritime zones, it's quite important for the negotiation process. We see this division into the territorial sea, the EEZ, and the high seas. Those concepts that were set in the Convention of the Law of the Sea, they are critical for the current negotiation process. In addition to that, the issue of shared stocks and the need of countries to coordinate when they have shared stocks. This is also critical. Critical because exactly as we have seen before, the negotiation on fishery subsidies is focused exactly on the common good. So most of those stocks are shared somehow. And there is need for the coordination between states when there is a shared stock. This is written explicitly in the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. That's the last one, I think. Sorry for trying to. I'm going now to ask you some questions about one of the most important, in my opinion, it's the most important instrument in FAO associated with fisheries, which is the FAO Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries. So I'm going to ask you, there are three statements there, just for you to try to check if they are false or true. So the FAO Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries, it's only applicable to governments, true or false. It's a mandatory instrument, true or false. It contains complex and not practical issues. So this is one of the, last year in 2020, FAO celebrated the 25th anniversary of the Code of Conduct. So it's a very important instrument. And if you see the results here, yeah, it's very interesting results. And we are going to see now some of the characteristics of the Code of Conduct. The Code of Conduct is applicable to any participant in the fisheries and aquaculture value chain. It's a very, very important instrument because it contains basic principles that if you go through those basic principles, most of the problems in terms of sustainability, I mean sustainability in a broader sense, sustainability in economic, in social, and environmental terms, would be solved, or any problem can be minimized if you follow those rules. So it's a quite comprehensive instrument. And for me, it was particular, that's my personal assessment, it's particularly interesting to see that in 1995, by the way, the same year that WTO was created, the Code of Conduct was also approved in FAO. So in 1995, countries were already able to approve such a comprehensive instrument that tackles issues that are only now, in maybe 5 years ago, starting to be debated. So it was a very comprehensive and a very future-oriented instrument. It was a very, very strong instrument. And it's anchored on shared responsibility, on an holistic approach, on giving principles to the industry and to governments. So the Code of Conduct is a very practical instrument. It's not theoretical, it's a very practical instrument that any participant on the fishery value chain, by the way, the code is divided into segments of the fisheries value chain. So any participant of the fishery value chain can adopt it. In addition to that, we have three basic instruments that are critical to the WTO negotiation process. The Port State Measure Agreement that has a set of guidance to eliminate and reduce IUU fishing. The catch documentation schemes, those are only guidelines for the catch documentation schemes. And then provide useful set for countries to adopt, to certify, to confer not illegal caught operations to the products, and the voluntary guidance for small-scale fishers. And that's also critical when you talk about small-scale participants in the negotiation process on fishery subsidies. We have to think that one of the major principles of the voluntary guidance for small-scale fishers is that one size does not fit all. In that, this is exactly the concept of special and differential treatment in WTO. So they are very, very interconnected. Just to finalize, I just would like to reiterate that we also have the mandate to address fishery subsidies from the Sustainable Development Goals that was approved by all United Nations countries. And that's a very strong mandate that we have under SDG 14 to end harmful fishery subsidies. And just again to highlight that, as you saw during the break, FAO has a specific program on sharing information on markets and on trade information too. That's called GlobeFish. Please access. You have the web address here at the right bottom corner, where you can subscribe to receive our newsletter. Thank you, Simon. Thank you for the opportunity again. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcio, for that overview of the FAO instruments. We have a few minutes for one or two questions. perhaps I can pull one out here. Marcio, the opportunity to tie these FAO instruments and other UN instruments to the WTO disciplines. This is clearly something that causes issues. What are the particular concerns that, to your knowledge, that confront the Asian region in particular, the APFIC region?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Simon. I would say that, first of all, we always have the problem of implementation by countries in general of many of the instruments that I have mentioned. But I would say that particularly with the FAO instruments, there is a very positive will towards adhering to the instruments and implementing them. We know that for the most complex instruments, it's going to take time for some countries in the region to implement them. However, I would say that it's more important at this stage that we are trying exactly to highlight or to bridge those links between the negotiation process and the instruments, is to have the national will to adopt them and to implement them. And that's something that we have in terms of the major ones, like the one that is the most critical one in terms of the implementation one, which is the PSMA, the Port State Measure Agreement, because the other ones are voluntary. And for example, the Code of Conduct that I mentioned as an important and very critical instrument for FAO, for the countries and for the industry, not necessary the countries has to say, that has to mention that they are adopting the Code of Conduct. What usually countries they do is that when implementing their national fisheries policy, they use elements from the Code of Conduct in their national policies. And that's clearly identifiable. So this is a very, I would say that we have different levels of agreements. Of course, the voluntary ones are easy to implement and easy to make, to adopt. But I would say that the most important issue is that in opposition to other agencies that have some very criticized instruments, FAO, we only have instruments that have a very positive will. And in fact, the instruments that I have mentioned here, they have been already approved by countries during the negotiations in FAO. I hope that you're muted, Simon.
Thanks very much, Marcio. We've got a couple of questions have come in now. I can just pick up one or two of these, I think, with the time available. We'll deal with the other ones down the road in the Q&A session at the end. I think what I'll do now is ask specifically the one relating to the use of labor or forced labor, how that relates to this discussion. It's not covered under the definition of IUU fishing, but obviously use of it is often interconnected or interrelated, and the use of forced or slave labor is a it's an opportunity or an advantage, and is therefore some kind of could be viewed as a subsidy in some way. Is this being rolled into the discussions, or is labor being left out of it completely?
Yeah, in fact, labor is not part of the discussions in WTO, but I would like to reiterate that when we talk about IUU fishing, there are some, because there is not a global IUU concept. The IUU concept relies a lot on the national legislation of the country. So what is IUU in one country can be legal in another one, and some countries can in fact adopt problems in terms of slavery operations in their fishing national fishing legislation. So if there is a vessel engaged in using slave work, for example, that product originated from that vessel in that country is illegal. So the IEU concept is a mix between the international, there is an international framework, but it relies on the national level too. So that's a very important notion. In terms of labor, I just would like to highlight that FAO is very concerned about the social responsibility in a broader sense and the work conditions in fisheries and aquaculture value chain. So what we are doing now, by request of countries, by FAO members, we are working to develop a guidance to the private sector in order to support the private sector identify bottlenecks and to comply with the base instruments that exist at the international level in the area of social responsibility, including working conditions, etc. So FAO pays a lot of attention to that. Thank you, Simon.
Thanks, Marcio. And one final one before we move to the presentation by David. We had a question here. The point that was raised that agricultural products and fisheries are linked or let's say grouped, clustered with industrial products, and whether there was a feasibility or possibility to separate fishery out of that industrial category. Is that a solution? Is it feasible, or is it even something that's desirable?
That's a very tricky question, I would say. I would say that for historical terms, as I mentioned, fisheries was not put together with agricultural products. And that goes back to the time before the WTO. It was GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade time. I would say that WTO, like FAO, is a member-driven organization. So, of course, there is room for any type of changes that can facilitate the negotiation process if proposed by members and if all the members agree on that. I would say that it would make sense, of course, in terms of having a cluster specifically for fisheries, particularly taking into consideration their unique nature, as I mentioned before, of some of the fisheries are common good, etc. But I would say that it's not an easy process. It's not an easy process at all. Thank you.
Great. I saw David sort of put his hand up. Were you going to talk to that as well, David, or was that just a...
No, just to complement Marcio on his point that fisheries is treated differently in the WTO, is treated as an industrial good, not a part of the agricultural tariff lines. And that implies also that fisheries and aquaculture are subject to the subsidies and countervailing duties agreement of the WTO, and not subject to the system of subsidies regulation under the agricultural agreement. So it's important that our rules already apply, only that they were not specifically designed to deal with sustainability, but with trade distortiveness. So just to emphasize the Marcio's point.
Great. Okay, that's a nice segue then into the next presentation, which happens to be you, David. So without further ado, if I can now invite you to take the floor and make your presentation, please, on the developing countries and the major concepts involved at the WTO negotiations on fishery subsidies. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Simon. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to use a presentation today because there is a lot of detail in this discussion. 1 second. No, I'm not sharing correctly. 1 second. Get the right. Can you see it, the presentation? Or just my desktop?
We can see your presentation, but not in presentation mode.
Let me add it here. Is it better now?
Can you swap screens? Display settings at the top.
Sorry, I'm lost.
No, go to the top. Yeah,
Display.
and yeah, switch your screens.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much for invitation. I think.
Sorry,
Yeah.
sorry, not yet, not yet. It hasn't happened. Can you click
It
it?
hasn't. Sorry, what should I do?
Can you click that swap presenter view? There we go. Perfect.
It's fine now.
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry for this technical little issue. Thank you very much. I've been asked to a little bit present the current status and some of the concerns of developing countries. The presentation I'm going today is my personal view, not the one of UNCTAD as an institution, and also it's the view of an observer. I'm not part of the negotiations. UNCTAD is not allowed as an observer, so we cannot follow all the debate. So it is based on text available and feedback from many developing countries. The first slide I wanted to show is that it's a well-known data from the OECD from about the public support given to fisheries. This includes good subsidies, bad subsidies. It not only apply to specific subsidies in the definition of the WTO, but it's a very large definition. Nevertheless, it gives you a good sense of volume. Who are the big subsidizers globally? And the chart includes basically countries that are members of the OECD plus China. And you can see clearly who are the countries that have been putting more resources into the fishery sectors, which can have many reasons, from sustainability, labor support, but also lack of competitiveness. There could be several reasons. But you can see that in the chart, the black line is the OECD average. Even until 2017 was not really coming down. You have in the red line China, which basically shows that was a increase in their subsidies for many years, especially until 2012, and then come down, particularly to increase monitoring and the WTO negotiations. You can see other actors heavily subsidizing Japan, United States, Canada, Korea, also the EU, but the EU in the OECD classification is divided among the 2070 countries and not added as a total, but it will be as important as Japan. So basically the values goes in billions of dollars, and the biggest subsidizer have been reaching 6 billion, but they have come down to level of 4 in the case of the biggest subsidizers, for a total average of $9.5–10 billion according to the OECD. This does not include other developing countries, but tell you that there are big actors behind this. And that's also one of the reasons that the negotiations are complex. You have big developed country subsidizers, but you have big developing country subsidizers. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about the status of the negotiations because Ambassador Wills was very clear. But my comments will be based on the second revision of the chair consolidated text, Rep 126, Rep 2. Most of the text is still under brackets, so I will be making reference to that. Also, it's important to know that these and other activities carried out by UNCTAD, FAO, UNEP, and other partners are part of an interagency plan of action to support the understanding and negotiations on trade-related aspects of SDG 14. Now, the structure of the draft chair note, it's important to know that we have a consolidated draft chair note only 3 times in the 20 years of negotiation. This is one of the few times, only twice, we have a text of the chair being used as the basis of negotiation. This is one of those, which is very important. And second is there is a second revision and proposals continue to arrive. But it's important that we have a common ground to advance, and this has been perhaps the biggest achievement so far of Ambassador Will, and I'm sure he will bring us to safe harbor. But what's the structure? Where you have articles related to scope and definitions, you have a core set of prohibitions on harmful subsidies. I call it the 3-pillar set of prohibitions. You can call it as you like, but focusing on the 3 main actions that are considered harmful: subsidies to IUU fishing, subsidies to fishing on overfished stocks, and subsidies concerning overcapacity, overfishing, with a potential cap and reduction clause. We don't know if they will come together or not, but it's there. there are some special forms of special and differential treatment all over those prohibitions. So they are attached to a specific prohibition, but also you have some horizontal special and differential treatment rules. There are many proposals, doesn't mean they're going to be accepted, but you have at several levels text related to that. There are rules on technical assistance and transparency, as well as in interinstitutional arrangements, dispute settlement, and final provisions. The last 3 points I will not address today. I will try to focus on the core elements of a potential agreement. Now, on the scope of definitions, for those that are not used to look at WTO rules, basically we're talking about subsidies that are specific. Subsidies defined as a financial contribution by a government or public body to a private one, you know. So there is an action, this from the state, a transfer of resources from the state or public actors to a private actor. The subsidies in principle should be specific, including sector, region, industry, or enterprise to be considered under the rules. Nevertheless, the issue of fuel subsidies, which is highly controversial, is on the table, and fuel subsidies, even if not specific, may be covered by the new fish subsidies discipline. In principles, do a footnote that was introduced some recent time ago. Access agreement payments are not considered subsidies within the definition of subsidies, and the reason is that they tend to be considered a transfer of government to government and not transfers from government to private sector. This is a very important aspect, especially for Pacific countries that have important access agreements, and a lot of the national income come from that. So that footnote is an important aspect for them. Now, the focus has been on harmful subsidies to vessels and operators. This is always interesting for me because vessels do not have legal personality. Vessels are objects, you know, but at the same time, vessels are subject to the law of the sea under UN clause. You also have operators, and I think these definitions should always go together because the operators are the ones that receive the subsidies, manage the subsidies, allocate the subsidies within their own business. So those are the legal persons or the individuals who own the vessels acting or engage in fishing. Now, important also for Asia and the Pacific, aquaculture and freshwater fishing is not covered by the discipline. So there is a huge policy space. That doesn't mean that they're not covered by the subsidies agreement of the WTO, by the way. They are covered. But in principle, they wouldn't be covered by this agreement. So we're talking about marine fisheries, ocean fisheries. Fish includes all living marine species. And this is very important because that includes then marine mammals, for example. We have been subject to fishing in certain cases, even for research and development, but include corals, include other type of marine species. The question if plant living marine species will be covered, algae, seaweed, it's very wide the way it is placed in the text now. Now, fishing, interestingly, does not only include the harvesting activity, but include processing and packaging. And I think that's very important because that's an effect on the value chain, not only on the first phase of from harvesting to landing, but also from landing to processing and packaging. And that's linked not only to, again, to the raw material in itself, but also to value-added activities that may be happening in many countries. So that should be also considered. The fishing here is a very large concept. It can, depending on how you interpret it, also services and not only goods. Now, you have again the three pillar prohibitions, as it was mentioned by Ambassador Wills. The number one is prohibition of subsidies that contribute to IUU fishing. The definition is based on the FAO plan of action to combat IUU fishing in a footnote that make it even more precise and binding. In principle, there is no obligation to make an IUU determination or finding by countries, but systems and regulations should be in place to identify and tackle subsidies given to IUU fishing. Again, as it was mentioned, countries do not on purpose provide subsidies to IUU fishing, but they may be providing subsidies to the fleet, and vessels within that fleet may be engaging in this type of activities. So they need to have systems to monitor and be able to identify when a vessel does that, and at the same time to withdraw subsidies if that situation occurs. Now, who makes the determination? First, term determination is unusual here. It's related to, it's not defined in the agreement. It could be interpreted as a decision by the member state or regional fishermen organizations to sanction to punish a vessel or an operator that has engaged in illegal fishing activities. Question mark comes, who makes the determination and how that determination is recognized by third countries. In the draft text, you include the coastal member states. That's normal. Flag state, again, normal. Subsidizing member, obviously, because we are talking about a subsidies agreement. 4 states based on the 4-state agreement of the FAO and regional fish management organizations. Nevertheless, several countries, developing countries, have been concerned about the application of the determination to flag state. This applies especially to countries that have flags of convenience. And you have situations where many countries, due to new regulation, illegal fishing, are deregistering vessels because they don't have the capacity to monitor illegal fishing. And if this agreement comes, they may feel they don't have the capacity to monitor the subsidization given by them or others, or to control sufficiency. So they would raise concerns. Subsidizing members, again, it's obvious, but that put the target on the responsibility on who's giving the money and not who's the owner of the vessel. What standards should apply? This was also mentioned by Ambassador Wills. Basically, there have been discussions on to what extent systems or mechanisms to make determination should look like, should be subject to, and then as we mentioned about the standards of transparency, non-discrimination, fairness, etc. What we have now in the text is that this determination should be based on positive evidence, not surprise, that come from the Port States Measures Agreement, to process that come from international law or applicable international law. Shouldn't be a problem. Some consider this is too vague, but even if you add fairness, transparency, and no discrimination, those are normal standards that you have in a due process internally. So I wouldn't consider them as threatening, but on the contrary, that they will help in the process. You have many developing countries where especially, for example, Sri Lanka, were mentioning the issue that there should be proportionality in relation to the withdrawal of subsidies when a vessel is engaged in illegal fishing, because there are different levels of violations, from very minor faults to very significant ones. So that in establishing the prohibition, members should consider nature, gravity, and repetition of the action to be considered in terms of the sanction and also the withdrawal of consequences.
I think we lost David's connection.
Yeah, we've just lost David's connection. It's just, okay, everybody, excuse us. Please bear with us for a few seconds. Let's hopefully David will reconnect. Can someone from INFOFISH please text to David and inform him? Yeah, my apologies to everybody. We've just lost David Vivas there temporarily in the middle of his presentation. We'll come back to that. Hopefully David can reconnect. Just while we're waiting for that, so please bear with us. Let me put a question up here to Marcio and see what we have in the box here. Marcio, there was a question, and you've answered it, I see, but it related to the issue of the small scale, the criteria for small scale fishing, and how crucial that is for the negotiation. And you did answer that in the question box, because at the moment there isn't a specific way to define small scale fisheries. But would you like just to talk to that response that you made there while we wait for David?
Sure. One important aspect is that, and then I'll go for not only small scale fishers, but any other fish concept that is not already internationally defined, is that when we try to bring those concepts to WTO with a clear definition, usually it causes more harm to the negotiation process than benefit. Because then countries start saying that, okay, but we do not have any standard in this regard. So that's what happened with small scale fishers. I remember, if I'm not mistaken, around 8 years ago or 10 years ago, the Secretariat of WTO compiled a document with all definitions of small-scale fishers in different countries to share with the countries and for the countries to realize how diverse that the definition is based on the country. So, of course, as far as I'm following the negotiation process in the last 15 years, what the countries are trying to do in WTO is exactly trying to avoid coming up with a definition in the new rules that are going to be adopted, but trying to refer to, for example, FAO does not have a definition on small-scale fishing. So they refer to WTO, not saying that, but of course, the instruments that FAO has, like the voluntary guidance on small-scale fishing, can be used as a reference for any kind of sort of definition. But the idea usually is not to come up with any concrete definition unless that definition already exists in the other UN instruments. Because otherwise, usually those kind of approaches create more problems than solutions for the negotiation process.
Thank you, Marcio. And yes, that's a very, very interesting point on this issue of small-scale fisheries defying concrete definition. And this is something, as you're well aware, we have been working in FAO, looking at this sort of multi-characteristic aspect of small-scale fisheries and how that can be used to at least give us a working idea of looking, when we look at a fishery, to get an understanding whether or not it's likely to be small scale or not. And this uses a sort of a characterization type approach rather than hard quantitative definitions. We're still waiting for David. Could I just, 1 second, can I just go to INFOFISH? Any news on David? Is he reconnecting or not? Charlene, could you help us?
Yes, he's trying to reconnect the Simon.
Okay, so we'll keep, all right, then Marcio, I'm going to put you on the spot again. Sorry about that. Let me just go through some of the questions that we have here. There was a question here. Who determines subsidies to fishing vessels targeting discrete fish stocks on the high seas outside the jurisdiction of a regional fishery management organization? We have David back.
Yes, can you listen to me?
Yes, we can hear you, David. Welcome back. Sorry, we lost you there.
No problem. I apologize on my house. Sorry.
No problem. This is the new world of meetings.
That was sabotaged by the subsidizers. 1 second.
There you go. So your information was too hot. Do you recall which slide you were on when you got cut off, or would you like us to?
I'm sharing now. I'm here on starting pillar 2. Is that
okay? So we lost you. We lost you at the end of pillar 1.
Okay, then sorry. Then I'll repeat. No, but you find in the text. It's fine. Can I continue?
Yeah, but please, can you turn your camera off, because your connection is still very stuttery.
And what I do with the screen?
The screen is okay, but we don't need your camera. Okay.
Let me.
Well, it might help. Okay, thank you very much.
If somebody can turn it off, that would be great. Yeah, I'll continue, so I don't lose the track. Thank you. I was mentioning that there are some inbuilt exceptions in Pillar 1 prohibition, which are basically that for developing countries and LDCs, the prohibition shouldn't apply when related to unreported and unregulated fishing.
Sorry, David, I'm sorry. Could you share your screen? Could you share your screen, please?
1 second, let me get out. I'm trying to share back.
Okay, we're
sharing
looking
now.
Yeah.
1 second. Can you see it now?
Yeah, we need it in presenter view. That's perfect. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you again. So the exception for Pillar 1 prohibition for developing countries and LDCs is related to unreported, unregulated fishing. And what this is very much into fishing anyway. It's basically the concerns that they don't have the capacity to always monitor and control fully the reporting on all activities, especially on a small scale and artisanal fisheries. And that once they have the system, they could come in. Exceptions in the case of IUU fishing are not the best, especially when we're talking about harmful subsidies. Pillar 2. Pillar 2 is about prohibitions to subsidies concerning overfished stocks. Again, the provision says that non-members shall grant or maintain any subsidy related to activities or fishing activities regarding overfished stocks. And in any of the following situations, and it's very explicit, lack of recovery, but then the stocks are already coming down below MSY, continuous reduction, so there is not a way to curb the decrease in the biomass, or they are overfished, meaning below MSY or alternative reference points. There have been very discussion of what alternative reference points mean, and that's a question that would perhaps Marcio complement here, because there are obviously alternatives. Now, who recognizes fine stocks as overfish? Again, here the answer is clear. The members within their own jurisdiction and by regional fish management organizations. There are nevertheless gaps. There are areas of the oceans that may not be regulated, or species that may not be regulated, especially in the high seas. So they may be in practice cases where no possibility of defining what stock has been overfished exists. Now, there is a controversial clause regarding the no application of these provisions if subsidies are implemented jointly or as appropriate measures to ensure rebuilding of the stocks above MSY, meaning above sustainable biological levels. There have been a lot of criticism considering this SNDT, and as I put it in the question from Ambassador Wills that I did some time ago, the reason is that usually the countries that have the capacity to do good management of their stocks or have systems to do that also are the countries that usually have the resources to subsidize. So it basically could mean in practice that many of the countries that are subsidizing will continue to subsidize if they have good management systems. There is a caveat, as mentioned before, that anyway, these subsidies should be done to ensure rebuilding if the stocks are below MSY. So they should be done for a sustainability purpose. That doesn't mean that the clause is not controversial. It still is very controversial. There is an exception of this prohibition for LDCs within the territorial sea, the 12 nautical miles as we know it. So an exception for them doesn't necessarily mean that it will be good for them to allow fishing on overfished stocks, but they will have to handle the problem nationally. The Pillar 3, this is one of the areas that was mentioned today. Ambassador Wills has a high level of controversy today or difficulty to get agreements. And there are several options here on how to introduce a provision on subsidies concerning overcapacity and overfishing. It's interesting to note, and I always mention this because our memory is very short. The first time that subsidies were mentioned in soft law internationally, and subsidies were regulated in relation to overcapacity, was in the FAO Plan of Action on fishing capacity of 2000, 20 years ago. So it is mentioned there, the concern already, and several members try to set measures in that regard, but there have been no international consensus thereafter. Now, there are three main approaches on how this Pillar 3 prohibition, if we want to call it like that, should work. One is a negative list approach, listing all the activities that should not be allowed, that mainly lists operational and capital costs. There have been some concerns expressed by some developing countries that in many cases they have under capacity, not over capacity, and they may need to invest, especially in capital costs, to have modern vessels that could comply with all the international regulations. Operational costs usually tend to be considered as an element that is negative because increases capacity, not only for fishing longer, but fishing deeper, etc. There is a second approach, which is basically prohibit subsidies related to overfishing and overcapacity, contingent upon activities done at the high seas, meaning that the subsidy is meant to allow, not to allow, but it's specifically meant to support fishing in the high seas. And this is another approach. It's not incompatible with the first one, even it's complementary and regulates more the situation in the high seas, which is an area where it's very difficult to manage. Second, we have a proposal coming from the US based on the WTO agricultural agreement. This is a system to deal with subsidies in the agricultural agreement, which is a system of notifying the amount of subsidies cap, meaning setting a limit on those historical notifications and then start a reduction process by different mathematical formulas to reduce those subsidies through time. So in this case, it's not about the quality, but about the quantity. It's a volume mechanism. And this is important because volume in itself, even if it's for a good purpose, obviously affect the conditions of competition and obviously create higher capacities on those who receive. So they will be always a not so marginal effect on trade distortiveness, but also on capacity. Now, there is also a clause, again, controversial, about the non-application of this prohibition based on the previous approaches. If measures are to be implemented to maintain a stock at a maximum sustainable yield, again, other way to see this and the previous proposal on reverse SMDT is just make it positive, you know, subsidies used to maintain fish stocks above MSY should be allowed. Subsidies that contribute to fish management should be allowed. It's a similar way to do it without having to get into this controversy. We have exceptions for LDCs for operation and capital cost. Again, issues of undercapacity, not of overcapacity. We have some exceptions for developing countries for the same, but in areas within their own economic exclusive zone, a little bit more restricted than the one for LDCs. And there have been some exceptions proposed for developing countries under a cumulative criteria that includes gross national income per capita, share of marine capture, distant, if you are engaged or not in distant water fishing, and a share of the agricultural GDP. This is a novelty. It's also very controversial. Why? Because this type of exception will allow certain developing countries to be covered by the prohibition, big developing countries, and may exempt also some big developing countries from the prohibition. So it's controversial because it's meant somehow to create categories among developing countries, especially because we have developing countries that have a huge share of the global marine fisheries capture. So it is presented as a way to cover some developing countries, but not all, based on an objective criteria. So while controversial, I think the fact that it's on the table is interesting already to start creating categories related of developing countries related to their contribution to the problem. And this may be also applicable later for climate change discussions, if ever linked to WTO. We have some horizontal and special and differential treatment, not so new proposals, but coming from previous proposals to create horizontal exceptions for artisanal fisheries. There is this proposal by Ecuador, Chile, and Argentina. Now, they present this exception through a set of criteria, including low income, resource poor, or livelihood fishing, fishing-related activities. While this could be criteria, the criteria is not totally objective. Sometimes for developing countries, setting exceptions based on economic indicators is difficult due to the difficulties to gather data. But we need to find a way if we want to set that. The question is, again, as Ambassador we said, is this artisanal fisheries engaging in harmful activities or not? And that could be managed at the country level if exempted from the agreement. We have the issue of transitional periods for LDCs, more time to implement. This is usually accepted by developed countries. We have a clause on exercising due restraint in raising cases or matters related to LDCs, basically try not to push them too much under the WTO system. There is not a recognition of a small island development states as a group in the WTO. Shall we have it? Shall we not have it? In the UN we do, and this is explicitly mentioned in SDG 14. So why not? They have special needs, and also not necessarily only for fisheries, but also could be very important for climate change. So it's a special case that I think need to be reconsidered in the WTO as a group. Technical assistance, sorry if I go a little bit past with a lot of detail, but it's a very complex text, and these are just surface elements, so it can get very, very deep. On technical assistance, well, the support now is not only given by developed countries, but also by developing countries declaring themselves in a position to do so. That's already happening sometimes, not only in WTO, but also in UNCTAD. We're receiving, for example, in UNCTAD, half of the extra budget contributions to promote development are from developing countries. I don't know if people know that, but in WTO should be less, but there are some developing countries that are contributing to the technical cooperation activities. So this is already happening. Having it in an article will make it, will imply a recognition, but I think that's a very positive situation. Also, the support can come from not only in terms of resources, but could come in terms of expertise. Some developing countries may have it over others. There is no reference in the text to support by FAO, UNCTAD, and UNEP. There was some in the past, but it would be important to rescue that. There is a reiteration of the need to have notifications under Article 25 of the Subsidies and Countervailing Duties Agreement. This notification applied to all subsidies that could be covered by that agreement. We should be notifying, countries should be notifying their subsidy support under this agreement already today. It's an obligation today. There are some notifications, interesting ones, for example, from India, but it will be important to have a higher level of notification, not only in the qualitative aspects, but also in the quantitative aspects, so we have more clarity. If we set a system of cap reduction and phase out of subsidies, that could be very important, the notification system, to comply with it to make it operational. By the way, on the three options on the, I forgot to mention, under the prohibition on overcapacity, the prohibition in terms of activities, in terms of geographical scope, or in terms of volume, it's important to know that they are not incompatible. They could be accumulative. So they could, they are not incompatible, they could be hybrid systems. Finally, maybe also there is text that could enhance the notification of Article 25, but also requiring list of vessels of operation having engaged in IUU fishing. I think that's an important element, not only at the national level, but we don't have a global list of vessels that have engaged in IUU fishing. We have efforts under the FAO. We have efforts on the regional fishermen organizations, but there is not an official list yet, but would need to be developed early or late. And many countries do not gather or create those lists. They just sanction the vessels, and the decisions may be published if they are judicial or administrative, but at the same time are not compiled on systematic basis. So I think that's needed, and support to get that done is also needed. They could be extended notification requirements, and this is just a preview. Don't get afraid. This is just to show how life will look. Here you have a chart at the left where you have all the requirements today for fish subsidies notification under the Subsidies and Countervailing Duties Agreement. Some of them are well known, some of the subsidies, subsidy per unit, policy objective, duration, statistical data, if available. But if you see some of the proposals for notification and transparency in previous shared draft text, not the current one, the notification requirements can be important. So my recommendation is countries need to start gathering this information now, especially the one of Article 25 increased notifications, but also they need to start thinking about setting the system, and they will need support for extended notification requirements, because this is very difficult data to gather and could be costly, and systems are not necessarily in place. With that, I stop here. Thank you for all. I'm happy to receive questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And yeah, again, apologies to everyone for that hiccup in the middle. But I think we got everything in the end. So thanks to David for bearing with us as well on that. Right, so now we have a Q&A session. We're running a little bit late. Hopefully that's not a problem for for the participants and attendees. We seem to be having a lot of enthusiastic questioning going on in the Q&A panel, and some rolling discussions, it seems, between Marcio and a few of the participants. So maybe I can now pitch a few of these questions to you both. And David, since you were last on, perhaps I can just go straight to you. We had a question relating, two questions, they're linked, but it relates to this aspect of government to government subsidies for access payments. And the question was, what percentage or what share of the total subsidies are considered to be government to government approximately? Any idea?
The reality is I have no clue, because countries don't tend to notify that. There are some countries put their agreements online and available, but usually they also make public the price per fishing day, for example, but they don't publish the total amounts in many cases. And they sometimes are mixed with tax revenue income, so not easy to say. So to be frank, I don't have an idea.
Okay.
That will imply extended notification requirements, to be honest.
Okay, and on a linked question to that, you did mention that government to government were not considered subsidies, but what about financial compensation paid for so-called private access agreements between a government and a fishing company or fishing association? So you're on mute, David.
Yes, that will be a price for the access to resources. It also depends on how the price is fixed compared to other actors. That's controversial. I would need to go deeper into the question. In principle, doesn't look to me, but that could be. Sorry, did you hear my answer or not?
Yeah, I did. Sorry, I was on mute. I'm losing the plot. Thanks very much. Yeah, that question was posed by a lawyer, and so I think you two can probably spend all day arguing the details. Over to Marcio. Now you've answered a question in the box, but I'll just bring that up. It was a question, sorry, not in a box. It was a question that David mentioned that you might talk to. And that is that in this aspect of determining overfishing, the use of MSY or alternative reference points. Would you like to just talk to that a little bit, how that side of the technical aspect of working out how we decide whether a stock is overfished or not, or a fishery is overfished or not?
Yeah, just maybe just going back to the question that you posed to David on the government to government and the last question, I would say that in general, it's very hard to have a true government to government payment associated with an access agreement. Usually you have a private entity involved, and that can already characterize a subsidy, depending on price differences, as David mentioned, etc. But a true government to government transfer, it's very difficult, it's very rare to exist, in fact. We know many access agreements that, of course, there is a private company involved, and that private company gets the benefit of the access agreement that the government is supporting the buying company rights to do that. Regarding your question in terms of MSY and in terms of assessing overfishing and assessing the stocks in terms of the negotiation process, this is a very complex question, I would say. It's in the core of the negotiation discussion, what elements to use, and I would say we have an example here during this series of seminars that was promoted in terms of multi-species stock assessment. So we have the cases that many developing countries pay. I think, in fact, there is a question about that. the problems that developing country faces in terms of stock assessment for all species, particularly in the case of tropical countries that have multi-species pattern. So that's I'll say I don't have an answer for that in terms of course MSY is being discussed as one of the normal benchmarks to be used. But of course, as it's not imposed in other international instruments, it's usually cited as one of the possibilities, but not imposed as the only solution. Most probably, that's going to be the same approach that's going to be taken in WTO. I don't know if David wants to add.
Okay, so that was a fantastic pitch for the APFIC webinar on stock assessment, which took place a couple of weeks ago and which you can find online if should you wish to find out a little bit more about multi-species MSY and some of the innovations about dealing with complex multi-gear, multi-species stock assessments. Just to add to Marcio's comment there, that this is obviously clearly a technical area where there is still work to be done in how we support particularly developing countries that have limited financial and technical resources to assess their stocks, and also where these stocks don't respond to the more common or commonly known single stock models for assessment that the big industrial fisheries may be using, but these don't apply particularly for these fisheries that operate particularly within domestic, within EEZs. Okay, now then, I have a question for David, please. Could you elaborate, you mentioned technical assistance. Could you elaborate on some of the assistance that might be provided under the UNCTAD, FAO and UNEP interagency plan of action?
Yes, thank you very much, Simon. The plan of action was devised a couple of years ago by UNCTAD, UNEP, and FAO at the contours at the margins of the UN Oceans Conference in New York. The idea was that the trade community is not very aware or knowledgeable on all the fish management issues. At the same time, the fisheries community is not aware about necessarily about all the trade obligations and agreements. So the idea was to create a bridge and provide integrated support at different levels that include obviously supporting negotiations, or more importantly, supporting the implementation of a subsidies agreement. But there are other tools including there, such as blue economy reviews, or ocean economy strategies at the national level, looking at different sectors, not only fisheries. There is a specific capacity building activities for small scale fisheries to ensure that they have the capacity to manage and to export. So there is a list of several activities. We are already implementing that with existing resources of FAO, UNCTAD, and UNEP. This is an example of the cooperation. I got also a question via WhatsApp that I would like to respond, a clarification on the issue of definitions when I was mentioning the point that do not only cover harvesting, but also cover processing and manufacturing. Basically, that's it's covered provided it is during the fishing activity in boats. Once landed, is not covered. So I just wanted to clarify that. And that's it. I sent the link to the chat of the plan of action. So if any member state is interested in benefiting from it, there is a clear list in a brochure of all the support activities we provide, and we can receive requests. The support is totally demand driven. So sorry, if you don't cry, you don't get fish. You know, it's a very, very, very simple system.
Okay, we'll all start crying. Marcio, any follow-up comment on that from the FAO side?
Sorry, Simon, I was typing some answers in the Q&A box.
Well, okay, actually, maybe, okay, sorry for putting you on the spot. Maybe just a follow-up, just to mention that that you had offered up the possibility for follow-on consultations around this subject after this webinar And Marcio, would you like to just explain how people might, or let's say member countries particularly, might get in touch to have some kind of follow-up discussion with you?
Yeah. Thank you for raising that, Simon. In fact, we have opened the possibility of one-to-one discussions after this event. Nevertheless, I know that the system does not allow last-minute booking of these slots, but I'm going to type my contact details in the chat box, so that any country or organization that want to discuss with FAO and UNCTAD, we are completely open to set calls in this regard so that we can discuss in more detail the current situation, of course, within our mandates in terms of supporting countries and organizations on that. So although for today, it's not possible any longer to book, but we completely say that we can continue to have this open discussion whenever needed from the side of countries or any regional organization. Thank you, Simon.
Okay, Marcio, and that would be to contact you through email or through some other link. Email is the best way. Okay, everybody who's still here from member countries and organizations, if you would like to follow up on that offer, generous offer for some technical advice and support, I suggest that you get in touch with Marcio and David. And we'll be happy to try and facilitate that if you want to come through APFIC Secretariat. Okay, looking at questions. Let me see. Now we have a question on dispute settlement. And I'll just read that to you. In terms of dispute settlement, will the general WTO dispute settlement process apply, or will a specific dispute settlement mechanism be devised in the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement?
Sorry. Yes, I can speak now. Sorry, I thought it was muted. Thank you. Yes, in principle, yes. Articles 22 and 23 of the WTO of the GATT agreement should apply, including the dispute settlement understanding, and also the specific provisions. According to the text, against these brackets, specific related provision of the subsidies and countervailing duties agreement. Lately, perhaps on dispute settlement, there have been a controversial discussion about what are called non-violation complaints. Those based on nullification and impairment should be allowed. It's very controversial. There have been similar controversies in the TRIPS Council related to intellectual property. And basically, it is controversial because you are complying with the agreement, but a country may be engaged in circumvention actions or circumvention through legislation. So it's meant to ensure that that the agreement is complied, even if legally. But it's a very controversial mechanism, even in the WTO.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, let me just roll down and see. We sort of covered this already on this aspect of the limitations or the challenges, particularly within the APFIC region, that countries may not have the capacity or does not have information on the status of its stocks. So could either of you give us an idea what, you know, if a country is in that situation, what happens? I mean, maybe it's providing subsidies, but it doesn't have information to defend or to explain that. Where would they be in that sort of position? What would be the implications of that?
They will be in a difficult position to showcase or present evidence of for the use of exceptions to start with. Also, I think it must be remembered, having a management system, all countries have some form of management system, all of them. The differences could be the level of sophistication, the amount of species cover, etc. But I think most of developing countries have one. I think what is important to note is that the provisions, to make things super simple, The provision of this agreement will be triggered if there is subsidy plus one harmful activity, meaning fishing, overfishing, or you engage in overcapacity. Especially the first two, there is a high probability that if you don't have a good managed system, you will run into troubles. Related to the last one, to prove that you don't have overcapacity may be easier, but that's a personal perspective.
And maybe just complementing what David said, one important issue, and I think it reinforces what Simon also mentioned a while ago, is that the importance of countries requesting technical assistance on those areas to FAO and other international organizations, depending on the topic. Because we see that when I presented all the FAO instruments, the basic structure is there. Of course, we know all the challenges that country faces, but at the same time, there is a clear, as David mentioned, there is not a single type of best approach towards fisheries management. We have simple approaches that can be quite effective in specific regions in the world. So I think these challenges only reinforces the importance that we as FAO being actioning in terms of providing technical assistance and support to countries. And we are here, but that's one of our objectives, of our goals too. Thanks, Simon.
Thank you both. I think I'm just looking at the time here, and we've had you all here for 2 hours, and so I'm conscious that that's straying into people's comfort breaks and what have you. And maybe I will pitch just a last question here to the both of you, and that is, what are some of the implications for the enforcement of key UN instruments considering the settlement of subsidy disputes?
Very good question. The first is that in the text of the draft agreement itself, you have many references to language that you use in different, for example, fisheries instruments, such as the Port State Measures Agreement, such as the International Plan of Action to combat and fishing, the law of the sea, etc., the UN clause. So there are references directly from those texts in the text. Second, I would say that complying with those agreements will strengthen your capacity to use some of the exceptions under the subsidies agreement. It also complements the objectives of this agreement. Thirdly, the WTO panels, when they have an interpretation of agreements, are mandated to look at the compliance of the specific WTO agreement. Nevertheless, the panels tend not to interpret, especially on trade environment issues, there is quite a significant jurisprudence, to interpret those agreements in isolation. They will take to look at other instruments. Even one question will be, it's not in the text, but one question that members can think of is, in case of gaps in interpretation of this subsidies agreement, if the panel should resort to directly to other international applicable law from UN clause and FAO agreements, that will make the enforcement of those stronger, so they will be mutually supportiveness, and at the same time will help fill gaps. Even people forget that there is the tribunal of the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea that has advisory decision on fisheries, you know, and system to fight IUU fishing. So I would say that that the relation is very important, and it would be great if the WTO could rely more on not only their own agreements, but also UN agreements in implementation or in decision making by the panel.
So yeah, so in conclusion, then the higher the degree of coherence and reference between the UN instruments and the WTO disciplines, the better all round, and that we would encourage member countries to bear these in mind when they go into the WTO discussions. Panelists, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time today. It's been incredibly illuminating. We've had up to 190 participants have benefited from the wisdom and the knowledge that you've been sharing so generously. The presentation that we've seen today, the webinar, is going to be on the INFOFISH website, so that can be viewed after the event. We've had the offer also to countries and organizations from Marcio and David to provide follow-up advice or try to address questions that they may have. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you also to all of the participants and also to INFOFISH for organizing this excellent webinar. And I hope that everyone has enjoyed it and has as much as I have, and have benefited from this window onto the world of WTO and the fisheries subsidies. I know that I know a lot more about it now than when I started. So thank you very much for that. And with that all, I would like to wish you a very good afternoon or pleasant day for the rest of you. And thank you all again for attending this APFIC webinar. Thank you very much.